I was born many years ago on the island of Trinidad.
I was born here in Hackney. My parents are from Cuba and Jamaica.
I was initially a Peckham lad, grew up in Peckham, southeast London.
I'm African, Jamaican, British.
I'm from London, and that's where I'm from, but Jamaica is my roots. That's where my parents from, that's my heritage.
As somebody born in Britain, from Jamaican parentage, I've always felt like a lodger in Britain.
If you want to know who I am, then the word that encapsulates everything is African.
Order. When I consider the magnitude of the subject which I am to bring before the House, the subject in which the interests not of this country nor of Europe alone, but of the whole world and of posterity are involved.
It's very significant. It's probably the most significant date, I think, for black people in this country that we've had in, I don't know, well, forever in my lifetime anyway, because it's the only time that we've had to really mark and reflect on what has been, you know, the formative process for us, the thing that has made us who we are today, really, coming out of the African diaspora through the Caribbean to here and now in Hackney.
When I turn myself to these thoughts, I take courage. I determine to forget all my other fears, and I march forward with a firmer step, in the full assurance that my cause will bear me out, and that I shall be able to justify upon the clearest principles every resolution in my hand, the avowed end of which is the total abolition of the slave trade.
This assertion that William Wilberforce and British Parliament freed African people, it's a no-no.
I think it's really important to commemorate the 200-year abolishment of the slave trade. I think it's something that we have to keep recognizing, and this just gives us an opportunity this year to make something big of it.
There's nothing to celebrate, man, nothing at all, really. All we have is to mark the fact that this is something which made us who we are today, and it is the grimmest part of our history. It's a part of our souls and who we are now, and it's also that part that we don't really want to visit very often.
So I think that the commemoration of the Abolition of Slavery Act here in England is a start. It's, and we need to build on it.
And so when everyone talks about the importance of 2007, for me, I just think, not in my name. If you want to talk about the actions of what Parliament did, that's your prerogative. But don't talk about it in the sense that as an African that I should be thankful for freedom, because it wasn't the 1807 Act that inspired African freedom fighters. It was acts like the Haitian Revolution. It was acts like the uprisings in Jamaica, the uprisings of Barbados. It was us fighting for our freedom.
I think slavery is a very sore topic. It's because it still dwells in people's heart today. It's people who's gone through it. I can't imagine how they feel.
They had rapes, they were flung aside, they didn't have nothing to eat.
People being ripped up from their roots and thrown in vicious circumstances into lands which they knew nothing about, in situations that they had never known could exist in terms of oppression.
I can never explain fully what they went through because I don't know. I only know snippets of it, and what I know is sad.
You're dislocated physically, you're dislocated spiritually, you're dislocated culturally. You end up being a non-being, a non-person, if it has the effect of taking away from you, dismantling all the apparatus of your person and your sacredness of your person.
I was absolutely horrified with what I was witnessing, and to even contemplate that it was happening in real life. But that was my first introduction of slavery, and it's appalling.
When you read back and you look at history books and pictures and so on, you do feel sad about the way one race of human beings treated another race.
On St. James Island, there was a cell for the men, but all the women were housed in the section where the privateers, slavers, lived. So that from the start of capture, black women were being abused by the white men. And throughout slavery, the black woman was always accessible to the white master at his whim. So the black man grew up through slavery, lived through slavery for over 300 years, let's face it, in a situation, it's horrifying when you think about it, you know, in a situation where the woman that he would love or want to love or feel love for could not be his, could be called by the master any night to sleep with him. So I believe that that created over time a feeling among black men of disempowerment.
It's important to listen to the voices of the slave. They felt it, they knew it, and they resisted it. They didn't just lie down, and they never thought of themselves as being subhuman.
But if we start to think of, if we were there, you know what I mean? I would have, you know, been a runaway or something, or you know, a Sojourner Truth, or Harriet Tubman, you know what I mean? Getting involved in liberation struggle in a real way.
We were fighting from the time we got on the ship to the time we got off the ship and on the plantation. We weren't submissive people.
You cannot keep a people down. There were 20-to-1 enslaved Africans to plantation owners, to slavers in the Caribbean. And there's no way that you could keep those people down without an army.
You know, field slaves and house slaves who got together to poison off their masters, who, you know, waited for the times when they were drunk, you know, to do their revolutionary action.
Whether we're talking about the abolition of slave trade, abolition of slavery, if you don't talk about the role that Africans played in their own emancipation, their own freedom, the African freedom fighters, you know, who never gave up, who never ceased resisting, if you don't talk about that, then what we're doing is reasserting this Tarzan myth, this, what they call the Great White Hope myth, that Africans can't free themselves, have never freed themselves, that we were waiting on the shores of Africa to be enslaved by our kindly European people who were going to bring us civilization. And then when it was the same people who enslaved us decided that it was time to, well, I've had a change of mind about that, it was they who freed us. And nothing could be further from the truth.
The process was changing. We were liberating ourselves.
The slavery experiment failed because you cannot make a human being into a commodity.
We don't get a sense of the strategies, the rebellions, the ways they resisted, etc., etc., etc. That part of it has never been recorded much, and we'd have to go into ourselves and research what we would have done then and there. I think all of us would come up with the idea of rebellion of some kind. I would have been an out-and-out rebel man. Yeah.
Most of the anti-slavery campaigners, most of the abolitionists were pro-colonization. They were involved with the missionary programs.
The church in history has made many, many mistakes. Whether we should apologize for that, I hope we have the ability to apologize for the mistakes that the church has made, and will continue to do so because the church is made up of human hands.
So we're talking about, rather than taking Africans out of Africa and enslaving them in the Caribbean, in the Americas, the agenda changed. So what happened when Africans were enslaved on the continent? As an African, that's just as repugnant.
As a child going to school in the Caribbean, but certain things were worrying as children. We noticed that in every area of society, white people were always in charge, in the banks, in the church, in education, in the schools, in the police, in the businesses, and the lands was owned predominantly by white people. Syndicate estates, 90-something% of all lands in the Caribbean, those islands belong to white people.
We became apprentices where we were still tied to the land, where conditions were still terrible for our people.
My father, he recognized that Britain was the power in the world, that the British monarch was ruled, and he had values which said that to be as close to British as possible was good. That was really the upbringing you had. You were brainwashed to be good colonial people who would behave yourselves, accept your status, and work for the empire.
The legacy question. Well, the legacy of enslavement is it's one of the things that make you tearful.
In the legacy of slavery, it's in here and it's in here.
It's the state of the world now. It's the dispersal of African people all over the planet, and whether those African people are being at the bottom of the social, economic and political rung.
The legacy of slavery for me is that my ancestors were enslaved and my ancestors were taken away from Africa, and my ancestors enabled me to be here today.
In terms of recent history, it means that whole dislocation through slavery, the diaspora.
A few years ago, I watched a program called Motherland. It had a really great impact on me. It showed a group of people that traced their ancestors back to Africa, and I wanted to do something like that myself. You know, it's a feeling like, you know, who am I? Where did I come from? You always want to know that, you know? I want to know how far I can go back. I sent off for the DNA kit, which is just a simple kit, just a simple swab that you rub against the inside of your mouth. My ancestors came from Senegal and came from the Mandinka tribe. I feel proud because I can trace back my African roots.
I went to Ghana.
Ghana?
Yes. A beautiful, beautiful land. We actually organised a trip with the children that we teach for them to see their history. And when they went back, they were astounded and they were astonished that there was actually TVs and telephones there. Because of the perception that they get on the TVs here of Africa, they don't realise that it's such a beautiful land. It's a place of a spiritual overwhelming. I was just so taken back. I went for a week with the children. I came back and 6 weeks later I went back again. I had to. It was just beautiful. The people were beautiful, the land. We went to Ashanti region, we did Emancipation Day there. So I actually went to the chief's home and he gave me the first part of my African name, which is Adua, because I was born on a Friday. So that was really good for me.
I think relocation is important, and that is perhaps what the Rastafari movement has helped to do, to relocate people, to make them find not only Africans, to find the Africa inside of themselves, but to also promote the cause of repatriation, where you could at least touch base with where you came from, as every major nation on earth should do.
See, part of the legacy is, and I don't know how many people admit it, but I'll tell you that a lot of African people look on us as those born in the West Indies and outside, you know, slave babies. And that's the mentality some people have. And then some people in the West Indians have the mentality that, well, you know what, you sold us into slavery. And so there's this conflict between what I would say is mum and dad, brother and sister. And these are issues that we need to sit down and address as black people.
I wanted to go to Jamaica and go to the Caribbean to find out what similarities I could find with Ghana, where I came from. And what I found, especially in Jamaica, but in fact in Trinidad, Jamaica, Barbados, is people that look like me, people that look like they could be related to me. And even people came up to me in Jamaica and Trinidad and the Caribbean saying that I look like their relatives. So people actually see me as someone they knew, which I found astonishing. I would love to kind of do a project one day with DNA and just kind of do my DNA and try and work it out that way. But just as I know that people in Jamaica know they have ancestors in Ghana, I know that I got ancestors there as well. That was my fascination with the place, is like a calling for me to go there and see what it looks like, because I knew my people were there.
When I first went into Africa, my mother, she's very fair, and she was like, and I came back, and I love African dress. You wear it in church and things like that, although I don't feel I can pay it as much as full compliment as I should be able to. My mother said, you know, why are you wearing those outfits? You're not African. And I said, well, yes, I am. I said, you're African, don't care how, and we use this term, how red you are, because she's very fair. I said, don't care how red you are, Mum, you're African, your descent.
Now, white people say, you see, look at black people, why aren't they progressing? We've abolished slavery, 1834. We're celebrating the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade across the Atlantic. And 200 years later, they're still not measuring up. But the problem is perception. The legacy of slavery remains in the institutions, in the systems that are in force.
Language is very important. The words we choose to use to express ourselves, to convey ourselves, to give ideological ideas out, it's essential. My name's Toyin, Olua Toyin Akbetu. It's a Yoruba name. It tells you who I am. It tells you that my parents have a belief in God. It's not a fashionable name. It has a meaning. When people talk about Africans as slaves, oh, they were slaves, this was slaves, slave trade. The idea of the slave trade is a repugnant idea. The idea that Africans were property. Slave, no, enslaved Africans. Trade, no, this was a crime.
The legacy of enslavement is racism, because to enslave people, you must believe you are superior. To have enslaved over 30 million African people between 1510 and whenever means that you, to put those people through that suffering, must think that those people are not people, that they are animals.
When we came to the mother country, while I didn't expect white people to open their arms and embrace me, I wasn't expecting the stark racism which was levied at me. On one occasion in the tube, I was excited at seeing the headline on the back of a newspaper about a cricket match, and we're passionate cricket lovers. And I couldn't wait until I got home to find out what the results were, because West Indies were playing in the match. I think it was West Indies against Australia. And I leaned my head so that I could read the headline at the back of a newspaper being read by an Englishman. And he turned to his friend and said, "Be damned, it can read. I'll be damned, it can read." He referred to me as the impersonal, as not human, not, it.
The legacy is still here because racism is still here. There's still a lot of prejudice against the black community.
Being harassed is part of another part of slavery, as I see it, because they want to tie me down and put me in cuffs and gives me orders. And at the end of the day, they ain't got the right to do that.
And also I feel that a great deal of that legacy is that we are still mentally enslaved. We do not realize that we can't hold someone else responsible for our condition now. Martin Luther King and all these other freedom fighters, they were people who actually said, we are not going to tolerate this no more. We're going to stand up and speak and have a voice and make sure things are changed. And we're not going to be silent until that's done. But I think within this community, particularly in Hackney, there's no one voice. We all speak, but in a black community, we speak individually. There's no one here trying to band us together and saying, look, let's all come together and work at seeing change or bringing about change for our community.
And we don't think about it but all around we see its effects. We see its effects in what goes on in Hackney today. We see its effects on our estates where we live. We see it out on the streets. We see it in our culture and the good things that have come out, the way that our people have blended together with our resistance cultures.
Look at you. Look at me. We are the legacy of slavery. We can't have slaves without slave masters, and we can't have oppressed without oppressors. Everything we are, everything we be right here now, we are the legacy of slavery.
It's being an African living on a continent in one of the most resources-rich places on the whole planet, and rather than Africans reaping the benefit of that, you have NGOs, you have capitalists, Shell, De Beers, raping all the resources out of the continent.
We used to have Tate and Lyle sugar, but then my mother and father, they discovered what Tate and Lyle was all about. That Tate and Lyle had grown big and fat off the backs of enslaved labor, and so they said they weren't buying that anymore. They started to buy silver spoon beet sugar or whatever it is, or buy some sugar from somewhere else like Mauritius. And so we didn't have sugar by Tate and Lyle. I didn't really understand the significance of that then, but I understand it now.
Being able to live in a diaspora, a life with some level of security, economic stability, whilst everyone back at home is suffering and dying.
This whole city around us, the whole of London, is based and rooted on what was looted from Africa. And that looting includes people. People were looted from Africa.
I think that the history of slavery has affected everyone who's been involved in it, some for the better, some for the worse. Some people have reclaimed a sense of pride, a sense of identity. Some people have lost something. I think Britain lost a part of its soul when it engaged in this practice.
The shadow, if you like, that's inside us, that shadow is cast by the image of racism. So you have the shadow, and it's where the light don't pass. And that shadow has been made by a big block of things, a big block of ideas that come out of what the experience of enslavement was about. And that's something that, although it might be inside us, must also be inside of white people today.
I am embarrassed. That's perhaps a better word than to carry the word of guilt. I am embarrassed how we, as the British Empire, has treated other countries. I'm embarrassed sometimes to say that I am a white English person and England is a powerful country.
We've got to relocate ourselves as human beings, not just those of African descent, but those Europeans who have lost their humanity, and they too have been dislocated by a superiority complex that has created this massive rift in the human community.
And it's reconciling and healing what has gone on in history. And again, that's reaching out, building the bridges and saying to a people, yes, we did this, we are a part of your history and we exploited your people.
Don't be ashamed of it. If you benefit from it, and you don't admit you benefit from it, if you benefit from it and you use that to continue oppressing, then you are inheriting the legacy of the slavers. If you're benefiting from it and you're giving something back, you're saying, you know what, this is part of my history and I know that it was wrong. I know that it was unjust. I know it was inhumane. And I'm doing the small bit that I can. It might not be much, but it's what I can do to change things, to make reparations. Because this is the real meaning of reparations, not compensation, which this childish debate always goes into. Reparations, repairing the damage.
We need to acknowledge people, and we need to think about the enemy in our heads still, and how there's still voices in people's heads that need to be talked about, that all of the changes that have come across, not everyone's had a chance to actually say, I'm sorry. No one's ever said that. And there's a need for it, and society must recognize that.
times have changed so much, kids don't even know about slavery no more. There's a lot of kids that don't know about slavery and know about history. You know what I mean? And they should.
I spoke to a group of children when we have Black History Month in October, and I said to them, what do you think of slavery? And nobody understood what I was talking about.
The young people today are so, they're so alienated to their, what we call roots, and they don't much care. And I think they don't much care because they've not been taught it from history, from their parents, from school. So they feel very alienated to what slavery means, what Africa means, what freedom fighting means. And they're going to have to be re-educated as to the reason why it is so important.
It's a part of your heritage. And even if it's not a part of your heritage, it's still a part of something that went on in this world. And I think everybody, whether they like it or not, should know about it.
Because I've heard it said that the government's making it compulsory. Slavery has to be taught in the school, in the national curriculum.
There's been a proposal for the national curriculum to be changed. And the language is very interesting. When government up to its tricks again. The new curriculum proposals are that we talk about slavery and Britain's role in the abolition. That's the agenda. That's what the government wants to teach children.
Slavery is a part of our history, but we need to go beyond slavery. Yeah, who were we before we were slaves? Because we weren't always slaves.
We have to look at our history, but our history doesn't begin in 1492 with Columbus. Our history goes back thousands of years before that to our roots, and our root is in Africa. And ultimately all people's root is in Africa. All people began somewhere around Ethiopia. That's where the first people lived, be it 3.2 million years ago, whatever it is. And from that we spread out across the world, and some of us stayed within what we would call the boundaries that we now call Africa. And from there came the cradle of civilization.
I would not be the person I am today if it wasn't for a history that I've learnt through the 40 years that I've been growing up.
We come from a proud, long line of ancestors, proud people, and we, if they had that instilled in them, I think they would feel more, have a better self-esteem, a better feeling about themselves, more self-worth, and I don't think we'd be having half of the problems that we're having today.
I am proud to be British, and I think with the greater voices that are being heard within our society today, we are now beginning to take on board that we are not the only history in the world. There are other people who can bring a much better vibrancy to the education of the future.
That message for young people must be one also where they look back and look back with pride at how it was that the process of enslavement, that slavery itself was abolished in the Caribbean, and that was done not just through abolitionists, which is the general message that, say, I learned when I was in primary school.
I would like to see a lot of things happen in the schools, in the junior schools, in the infants, because I think it needs to be sown there so that it will grow.
In the curriculum that I use, I try to make it culturally inclusive so that the children are actually seeing something that represents them. Instead of every day looking at white middle class education, we've got something that actually represents all of our people.
We've got to get the mindset of people to change through education, through actions that will foster equality. Anyone now, in my view, who embraces the practices of racism, I think they are just as guilty as those people who perpetuated racism in the first place, who set up the slave trade and so on and so on.
We need more unity because it's only through collective organization that we can change things, because the structures in society are very, very strong. And the glass ceilings to pass through, one person can't really break through them too easily, but as a group, it's possible. And you can't wait for people to open doors for you. You have to do it yourself. We learned that through slavery.
And if we look at other ethnic groups who've been through tremendous, horrific, inhumane things, we find that they've embraced that history, they've embraced that pain, take for instance the Jewish people. You know, they've embraced the Holocaust. Not to say that we're happy it happened, no, but we're saying it happened to us and we're not going to let you forget. And the world never forgets, but the world has forgotten slavery.
I'd just like to say that I hope we can get to a point where there is equality, where we feel that everything that we are doing makes a difference to the people, because the younger generation needs to know that we work together and that we value everyone, and that's so huge.
We're doing this not for ourselves, because there is this whole guilt thing. I feel guilty, African and European. I feel guilty and I'm doing this thing to make myself feel better. That mustn't be the motivation. The motivation must be the children. It must be, if we've inherited a crappy legacy, then we're going to do our best to make sure that we leave a better legacy and that we've learnt from that legacy, and we're going to empower them from that legacy. We're going to teach them that history can be a tool of empowerment, not just a tool of oppression or disconnection, of making people feel ashamed of who they are, but a tool that leads to aspirations.
If we can embrace, which I think is the problem with most people, all the levels of our capacity for being, it makes us perhaps at peace, not just with ourselves, not just with our brother man and our brother woman, but with nature itself, ultimately. You know, it's like life is one great total conspiracy of unity. And I suppose men have fractured it so that there's a lot of conflict in life. And in this year dedicated to abolition, perhaps we can reformate parts of that humanity that were lost in the tragedy of 300 years of slavery. What do you think, Kwaku?